eating this apple?
Well, it was there.
Are you hungry?
No, well, a bit.
Have you not just finished eating?
Yeah.
Well, is this apple yours?
No.
And whose apple is it?
It's yours, I think.
So, well, why are you eating my apple?
Yeah, because it was there. Einen wunderschönen guten Morgen, Tach. This is Julian Anton Arnold Allgeier. You can call me still JtripleA, and this video will be about the question whether we, as human beings, truly have free will. So, what you've just seen is a rather famous conversation between a patient called CU and a researcher, which happened approximately 20 years ago. So this patient had a stroke, and this caused him to get this rare condition called utilization behavior. And this behavior is typically characterized by an inability to stop oneself from interacting with objects presented in one's environment. So patients suffering from this condition may, for example, be unable to stop themselves from drinking water put in front of them, even if they're not thirsty, or also they may start writing on a piece of paper when a pen is put in front of them, and a piece of paper, even if they are not told to do so. And in the conversation, where you could just see my astonishing perfect acting skills, patient Zio tries to retrospectively kind of justify his actions, so that he is not only able to explain his actions to others, but also to himself. Upon asking this patient later what the reason was for his actions, he simply said, "My hands move by themselves." So in the neuropsychological literature, the uncontrollable actions of his hand have been sometimes called alien hand. But this is not totally accurate, because individuals with this utilization behavior, they do not report the presence of external control, some kind of alien which externally controls their hands, but rather an absence of internal control. So a term like anarchic hand is way more appropriate. Arguably, patient CU experiences a limited form of free will. So, at least in terms of movement control, if you think about it, and certainly the ability to be in control of one's actions, independent of external influences, is a fundamental aspect of free will. But why do we think we have free will? Why do you maybe think you have free will? Basically, there are two key assumptions people tend to have. So firstly, it just feels like we are the author of our actions and decisions. For example, I can definitely freely choose to take this seva and throw it away. Secondly, we really tend to think that in hindsight we were always able to have done otherwise. So in hindsight, I could have thrown something else. For example, this stuff here. So traditionally, philosophy and neuroscience have focused on two different aspects of free will, namely agential control and the possibility to have done otherwise. The latter, largely studied by philosophers, deals with the issue that the world is deterministic, meaning that an event can only cause one single following event. In obliging to the laws of nature, some philosophers have argued that even if we perceive ourselves as always having options to choose from, in the end there's always only one single flow of actions. In contrast, agential control has been the object of focus dominated by the field of neuroscience. We are feeling to be in control of our actions, but does this feeling to be in control necessarily mean that this is also the case? So, thanks to advances in modern technology, we are now able to measure electrical brain activity with high temporal resolution, for example using an electroencephalogram or EEG, or neural blood usage with high spatial resolution, for example using a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine or fMRI machine. Naturally, neuroscientists take a monistic view of the mind, meaning that it's made of the same substances as the remaining body. The central idea of dualism, in contrast, is that the mind is non-materialistic, hence something which does not obey the laws of physics. Monism seems to be a prerequisite for neuroscientific studies on free will to be meaningful. Otherwise, it would be difficult to bring the argument forward that free will, derived by the mind, is something that is physiologically quantifiable. One of the first studies in neuroscience on free will that gained attention from the wider scientific community was published in 1965 by Kornhuber and Dieck. The researchers here asked participants to perform voluntary limb movement whilst simultaneously recording their slow brain potentials using EEG. So they asked them to do a simple movement such as this one and recorded simultaneously their electrical brain activity. And what they found was, unsurprisingly, was that there was approximately 1 second preceding the onset of a movement, cortical potential, which they called the Bereitschaftspotential, or in English, the readiness potential. This was suspected at the time to be a biomarker of the intention to move, a conscious decision. 18 years later, aiming to advance the understanding of this readiness potential, one of the most famous studies in neuroscience was conducted, namely the Libet experiment. So here, in addition to the methodology from Kornhuber and Dieck, Libet and colleagues asked participants to watch a clock and report as accurately as possible the exact timing when they consciously felt the urge and intended to move. Findings indicated that the readiness potential did not occur simultaneously to the urge to move, but several hundred milliseconds earlier. It was argued that this electrical potential shortly before having the urge to move could be a biomarker of unconscious brain activity rather than conscious brain activity that is causing an intention to act. Kornhuber and Dieck's experiment did not really shed light on the question of whether free will truly exists or not. However, Libet's findings made him assume that free will might be an illusion, as there's seemingly unconscious brain activity before an individual consciously intends to act. So if true, Libet's findings have major implications for ethical questions of individual responsibility. How can you, how can I be held responsible for actions if unconscious brain activity seemingly causes and therefore controls my, yours and ours intentions? What is really important to mention here is that these studies are rather old. There are lots and lots of theoretical and methodological aspects of the Libet experiment that have been heavily criticized. So I just want to outline these studies because I find them really, really interesting. But if you want to go a little bit more into detail, I'll recommend to just read them yourself. They're all linked below in the description. The studies I've discussed so far, especially the Libet experiment, suggest that we may have less conscious control of our actions than we might think. Ignoring alternative explanations and critiques of their method used for a moment, one could still think that there is at least a possibility of a free will. So even if we are not the authors of our intentions, we maybe can still consciously intervene with what your unconscious brain activity is proposing. This idea was actually tested by Libet himself in a line of research that was later called veto experiments. The experimental setup here was essentially the same as in the Libet experiment. However, participants were now asked to always resist doing the movement after having the intention or the urge to move. In their results, they still found this existence of the readiness potential, this unconscious brain activity preceding the intention to act. However, participants were now indeed able to stop their movement even after this readiness potential occurred. So what I find really interesting is that this readiness potential I've been talking about so much has actually been localized in a specific brain area called the pre-supplementary motor area, or pre-SMA. So it has been argued that the unconscious brain activity preceding conscious intending to act possibly originates in this pre-SMA. And what I find really interesting is the question, what would happen if researchers would artificially stimulate this pre-SMA using an electrical current? And guess what? Friedel already in 1991 did exactly this. He used a low electrical current where he directly stimulated this pre-SMA. And what I find really fascinating is that participants really reported having had the urge to move, and at higher currents they even moved that respective part involuntarily. If you listen carefully, you will be familiar with a condition where an individual seemingly felt similar urges to move without consciously deciding to do so, namely utilization behavior. And as you might expect, that exact brain area, the pre-SMA, is exactly that one which is lesioned in those individuals suffering from utilization behavior. And arguably, patient CU did not have issues with free will, but free won't. As we said, he was unable to stop himself from interacting with stimuli in the environment. The pre-SMA seemingly does not have the function of initiating an act of free will, but the inhibition of unwanted movement. And relating this idea back to the Vito experiments, this is exactly what they have found. There is a free won't, not a free will. And if stimulated, this pre-SMA does not inhibit feelings of object interaction anymore, which normally makes sure that our actions are not enslaved by external stimuli or environmental cues. So summarized, neuroscience seems to have shown that there is not necessarily a brain area for free will, but for free won't. We as humans have an amazing repertoire of actions, being able to move almost all of our bodily parts voluntarily. Constantly we are exposed to external stimuli and objects in the environment with which we can interact. Having a brain area aiding us to inhibit this automated interaction between our bodily muscles and external objects is very beneficial. It saves restricted energy supplies, equipping us to control which action we want to pursue and which we do not. And what happens if we lose this ability can be seen in patients CU or in patients in general with utilization behavior. The neuroscientific studies I discussed are all related to aspects of agential control, not the possibility to have done otherwise. Also, they help us to understand which brain areas and circuits are involved. However, they do not explain us ever why these brain areas are active and how they became active in the first place. Critically, neuroscience has neglected not only the possibility to have done otherwise, but also a more long-term general form of free will. Think about it. The experimental paradigm discussed measure free will in a really sterile environment by letting participants arbitrarily pick a moment when they intend to act or feel the urge to move. So, for example, in the limit experiments, participants reported an intention to act whenever they felt like it. How proximal is this to real-life situations where humans have a feeling of free will, where you have the feeling of free will? Admittedly, people's feelings of free will do not exclusively originate from short-term movement and intentions to act. What about distal intentions, such as planning and goal setting for a distant future? Those are not limited to the next moment in time. They range from hours, what should I eat for dinner, to years, where I'm spending my next year's summer vacation, or even decades, where should I spend my time after retirement? Though patient CU clearly has troubles with its proximal intentions, he was well able to plan the next day and set goals for the future. Cleansing goals are arguably also feeling to be freely chosen and are therefore also part of people's feeling to be in control of their action and of their feeling of having free will. So the neuroscientific studies discussed only have really limited validity to these things and to this more long-term approach. It's difficult to generalize from these short-term findings to a more long-term regard. Okay, so where do we end up? Do we have free will? Do I have free will? Do you have free will? I can't tell you. I think philosophy and neuroscience have yet to truly prove whether we have free will or we don't, whether we have free won't or we don't. For me, it's not really crystal clear. But what I believe and what I think at the moment, fully aware of the fact that I might change this opinion in the future, is, I think, really well captured in a famous quote by the German philosopher Schopenhauer. And it goes like this: you're free to do what you want, but you're not free to want what you want.